one more time for another video. My name is Katie and today we're doing a review of a manga series called Boys Run the Riot by Keiichi Gakko. This is quite a short series. It is complete at 4 volumes and it's published and translated into English by Kodansha Comics. This is a story about a trans high school boy and it is authored by a trans mangaka. This series follows high schooler Ro, who is a trans boy. He's not really out at school when we first meet him and he's sort of struggling with how to dress in terms of the uniform and how to speak about himself and refer to himself in the presence of others. We meet him when he's just feeling really misunderstood, experiencing quite a lot of dysphoria and some bullying as well. He's really unhappy and sort of angry at himself for not being able to fit in and trying to fit in while still trying to learn how to be comfortable with himself and his body. Our second main character is Jin, who is a high school boy who's sort of a year older than Ro, but he's in the same class because he's been held back a year. And he's a very confident, outspoken kind of person who just seems very self-assured. And he's one of those people who just stands out and he doesn't really care what other people think. Quite soon these two sort of get connected, and although they have a bit of a rocky start, they end up forming what I think is one of the most beautiful friendships I've seen in quite a while. And they soon find that they both have a passion for self-expression and for fashion. And that is essentially the premise of these two boys figuring themselves out, in particular Ro trying to figure himself out and how he wants to express himself, how he wants to identify, and coming out to the people around him. And also learning how powerful self-expression and sort of taking control of what you wear and identifying through the clothing that you wear, how powerful that can be. These two teenage boys figuring themselves out, supporting each other, and getting really into fashion and trying to make it in the fashion world. All the while exploring issues around identity, self-expression, gender, sexuality, masculinity, societal expectations, familial obligations. It's really incredible. So firstly, I'll talk about some of my favorite things about the series. Firstly, the relationship between Ro and Jin is just my favorite. I love their dynamic and I love how they interact with one another and how they both sort of hold space for each other, really expressing themselves and figuring themselves out, while ultimately just being really supportive of one another. I love the premise of exploring identity through fashion and how that enables us to have some really interesting conversations around expression, expectations, confidence, and even what it means to exist as a trans person in places with strict rules and uniforms like schools and workplaces. I love the overall message of this manga, which for me was very much about the fact that everybody has their own challenges and ways in which they feel like they can't conform or don't want to conform to societal expectations. But rather than further repressing and limiting ourselves, it's through vulnerability and honesty and mutual respect that we can learn to appreciate ourselves and to figure out who we are, and to also find meaningful community where we are valued. This manga also really challenges the idea of what success is or what it should be. And often that is very much associated with professional success and wealth. Instead, this manga really champions the idea of self-fulfillment and happiness and connections being so much more indicative of a life well lived than money. Although it is certainly sometimes hard to read, I really appreciated just how vulnerable and honest this manga was, especially in terms of exploring some of the lived experiences of Ro as a trans person. For example, some of the themes and situations that we explore throughout the manga series, and I suppose these could also serve as some trigger warnings for people, are things like some pretty severe bullying and transphobia, discrimination in the workplace and at school, especially around uniforms and gender presentation, people misgendering and just generally invalidating Ro and his gender, people being outed, Ro exploring elements of his own misogyny, as well as issues around comphet or compulsory heteronormativity and how sexuality is or is not tied to gender for Ro. Some of these things are definitely explored in more depth than others, but I think having such a complex, nuance and varied sort of look at gender expression and gender identity and gender performance in the world, I think was really effective. Another thing that I loved is that although this can be quite a hard-hitting emotional story that explores in depth many of the challenges that Ro experiences, it's also really joyful. This is ultimately a story about self-expression, self-acceptance, and community, and it's just beautiful. I also really enjoyed the art. It's very expressive, sometimes almost to an exaggerated extent, but I think it just really brings across just how intense some of these emotions that are explored are. The art is mostly character focused and it's quite a lot of dialogue between characters happening, but all of those characters are very distinct and I do appreciate that. And of course, some of the colored pages that we get are just gorgeous in these books and the covers are amazing. I love them. I also love that we do get to explore a little bit about performance, expression, and masculinity through the character of Jin, who is cisgender. He's quite a blokey kind of guy, and I do like how we get him sort of exploring his own expression and what it means to be a man for him, and that gender exploration is not just lumped onto the trans character. Ultimately, I would say that this is largely a character-focused manga. We are mostly focused on Ro and then Jin and then a few of their friends that they sort of collect throughout the series, as well as their interactions with their families. But I do feel like this premise and this narrative of them putting together this fashion brand, coming up with design ideas and figuring out how to actually make everything happen and like gathering funding and all of that, like it does provide a good sense of direction and momentum for the characters in the story as well. And it also allows us to see very different people with very different experiences coming together for a love of expression and fashion. And it's just really exciting to watch. Now, I do have a couple of mild criticisms of the series that I just wanted to include here in this review as well. First of all, it's short, and that's kind of a double-edged sword for me, right? Like it doesn't overstay its welcome, certainly, but I did feel like especially the final volume was a little bit rushed. Basically, although I really appreciate that it wasn't unnecessarily dragged out, I also didn't feel like it fully reached its potential in all of the areas and all of the things that we set up throughout the series. There were some really interesting and complex questions raised, especially in volume 3, around things like compet and dating as a trans person that I thought we were going to explore more in volume 4. And I was really looking forward to further development of both the characters, but then also the exploration of those themes. But the final volume, volume 4, did feel like it preferenced the story around the fashion brand and the progress of the fashion brand a little bit more heavily than the character development. And so I felt like some of those things that were set up in prior volumes didn't really get to be fully fleshed out in the way that I was hoping in the last volume. And secondly, this could be a criticism or not, depending on who you are as a reader, but I just felt like it was worth mentioning. And that is that this manga is one of those mangas that's just very forward and direct in its messaging, which I think can be a positive thing in the sense that it's very clear and almost like informative. Like a good introduction into a trans experience for people. But I suppose sometimes it did feel like it was a little bit more tell rather than show. So although I wish the final volume had just that little bit more room to breathe, maybe it being a 5-volume series rather than 4 would have been perfect in my opinion. Overall though, this is still just such a solid series that I'm so happy to have discovered and to have read. Ro is a character that will stay with me. I just feel like you get to know him so well and he's so just intimate and vulnerable throughout the series, but you still get to see him love and laugh and just enjoy life and to really start to develop a sense of self and a sense of community that's really meaningful. He's just a wonderful, wonderful character to watch grow throughout the series. And then Jin, I loved Jin as well, and in particular the relationship that they have, the dynamic that they have, and just how respectful and supportive and encouraging they are of each other. It's just beautiful to watch. I love them as a duo. Personally, I did feel like volume 1 was one of my favorite volumes of manga I've ever read. It was that good, it was that impactful, that emotional, and that good at setting up both these characters and the story itself. And overall, this is a series that I'm just going to remember really fondly, and I think it's one that I'll want to reread and return to, and definitely one that I will recommend and hand sell at work as a children's bookseller. I think this is just a great, solid series with a lot of heart and a lot of intention put into it too. And at 4 volumes, it's a very quick read and definitely one I recommend overall. So not a super long video today, I just wanted to share with you that series because I think it's fabulous and I want more people to know about it and to read it. I would love to hear in the comments below if you've read this series and what you think of it, or if you have any other manga recommendations that you think I would love. If you have any further questions about this series, feel free to leave those in the comments below and I'll do my best to get back to you. But until next time, happy reading and so much love. Bye!